Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second in this year's JV Clyne Lectures at UBC, hosted for the university by Green College. Those of you who were here yesterday should know that, and this applies both to people watching online as well as in the room. In fact, it's of possibly even more interest to people watching online. We now have a wandering microphone. So when it comes to the question and answer session after the lecture, raise your hand when you're ready to put a question or make a comment, and I will endeavor to get the mic to you so that people watching in other places can follow the drift of the Q&A in a way that they couldn't so easily yesterday. I will take for granted most of the preamble and introduction that we had yesterday, except to underline again, as we do on these occasions, that we are doing our thinking and talking once again on the traditional, ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam people here at Allard Hall on the Point Grey campus. Addressing, as we are now, with the extraordinary assistance of our speaker and lecturer, the anxieties of our time. The first lecture yesterday laid out a panorama of that complex of anxieties and hinted already at some of the resources available to us in various traditions of thought and practice for beginning to address them. This, I suppose, is the lecture at which the rubber hits the road and we begin to get some traction on the difficulties in question, thanks to some of those existing resources, howsoever retooled for the moment. The title of this second lecture then, and let me remind you perhaps and everybody else of the overarching title, which is That a Beginning Be Made, and we must now be getting towards the middle of something, That a Beginning Be Made, a Rule of Law for Our New Age of Anxiety. Lecture 2, The Fight to Recover What Has Been Lost. Stephen Toope.
Well, thank you very much, Principal. It's just fabulous to be here, as I mentioned yesterday, and to be in this beautiful place. And I, too, acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, which we are currently hosted upon. In yesterday's lecture, as Mark indicated, I painted what must be admitted to be a rather grim portrait of some unique attributes of our age of anxiety. I suggested that the pervasive anxiety of the era is grounded primarily in three interlocking sets of concerns over populist nationalism, globalization, and socially disruptive technologies. Although, of course, these issues are experienced differently by diverse types of people. Today, I want to argue that there are ways to navigate through this complex anxiety, that we can draw upon a rich intellectual heritage for both reassurance and inspiration. From ancient Greece through to 20th century American philosophical pragmatism and to contemporary theorists of social practice, we can derive insights that will help construct a modern understanding of the role of law in society. So today, I focus on this conceptual framework. In turn, the conception of pragmatism, which is really the focus of my comments, when put into day-to-day practice through a reformed, modest rule of law, can help to alleviate some of our anxieties, as I will try to detail tomorrow. For the journey homeward, arriving by roads already known at sights and sounds one has sensed before, the knowledge needed is not special. The sole essential, a sad unrest, which no life can lack. W.H. Auden, The Age of Anxiety. In his great poem, sequence, The Age of Anxiety, Auden reassures us that there is a way home, that we're not trapped in a wasteland of fear, uncertainty, and profound anxiety. He doesn't deny the forces that cause those reactions. In fact, he catalogues them coolly and precisely, as is his wont. But he urges us not to give up, rather to seek roads already known that can lead us to safer ground. What I find most encouraging is Auden's assertion that the knowledge needed is not special. Our way home is not dependent upon elite expertise. It is a cultural heritage in which we can all share in its diversity. The heritage that we call upon has roots in Greek classical thought. Aristotle argued that humans can acquire what he called practical wisdom, phronesis, not only through following general rules, but in the creation and evolution of practices learned through proper upbringing and habits gained through experience. People reflect upon those practices, reasoning over time, and thereby learn through their day-to-day existence. They work out for themselves what they should do. Practical wisdom is manifest in deliberative ability and in emotional and social skills that allow us to take our understanding of the good life or virtue and fulfill it in concrete circumstances. For Aristotle, all people and things are oriented towards some purpose. For individual human beings, the primary aim is well-being, sometimes described as happiness. Although I don't like that term. I think well-being is better. Human institutions, including law, are likewise purpose-driven, not merely static structures. For political communities, there's a double purpose: the promotion of human survival as well as the achievement of the good life or life of virtue. This purposive understanding of existence has been hugely influential in philosophy and sociology. The 12th century Talmudic scholar Maimonides argued that the perfect person would use knowledge for the improvement of the political life of themselves and of the community. Philosophers and sociologists of the 19th and 20th centuries argued that action is only rational when oriented to goals and values, and that this action is what creates our social reality. The pragmatist philosopher John Dewey aimed much of his work at helping people to develop a sense that they could, and I quote, direct their social existence towards their chosen ends, rather than leaving all that happens in life to blind accident, end quote. Pragmatist philosophy focuses intently on the role of social actions. Dewey argued that the social world was essentially one of evolution, with knowledge emerging from practice because acting actually precedes knowing. That's a hugely important point, obviously open to debate. In this view, Dewey followed Hegel, who argued that the very identity of people is built up in social practices. But Dewey went further to stress that the public is also constituted as a community through action, not simply discourse or talking. And this concept was picked up by Hannah Arendt. She argued that power in society is made real only through common projects of speech and action in concert. And she stressed that power itself is constantly in play, shifting, and is never static. Why has a tradition of pragmatist philosophy and sociology grown in influence in our era? And I think it has. Well, as described by contemporary pragmatist philosopher Richard Rorty, pragmatism makes three fundamental claims. First, that there is no knowable transcultural human essence or nature because knowledge is created through practice in community. Second, that all human inquiry is oriented towards practical problem solving. And third, that our beliefs are action guiding. What we believe matters to what we do. Now that may seem obvious, but it is not generally a shared philosophical perspective across all philosophers. For that reason, humans are infinitely creative, according to the pragmatists, and if we work together, as Rorty says, we can make ourselves into whatever we are clever and courageous enough to imagine ourselves becoming. Pragmatists, of course, do not deny material, structural, and cultural constraints on action. Some people start out in situations where freedom of thought and action is much more limited than for others in different situations. However, pragmatists argue that the bonds of our lives can be broken through shared problem solving. This point seems to be supported empirically because no society in history has ever been absolutely fixed. The Roman Empire collapsed. So too the USSR. Europe in 2021 is fundamentally different than it was in 1945. Vietnam today is a market-oriented socialist state that could not have been predicted in 1966. Likewise, individuals whose lives can change dramatically through intention and effort if opportunity is created in diverse communities. All right, let me unpack those ideas because they're going to be relevant to the remainder of my argument. The key to understanding pragmatism as a philosophical construct is that human beings need to have beliefs that can lead to better action and better lives, contributing meaningfully to the social world. Pragmatism eschews abstraction. Dewey argued that when a theory is, quotes, not tested by being employed to see what it leads to in ordinary experience and what new meanings it contributes, this subject matter becomes arbitrary, aloof, what is called abstract when that word is used in a bad sense, to designate something which exclusively occupies a realm of its own without contact with the things of ordinary experience, end quote. So pragmatists reject ideal theory. They're not Kantian, in favor of learning primarily from experience rather than abstract thought. John Dewey placed great store in learning through action rather than logical deduction. He believed that intuition and impression were highly influential in the creation of knowledge throughout human history. He argued that it was the need to justify our practical observations to others that created our contemporary focus on the operations of formal logic. But he suggested that we had to reclaim our connection to a logic of discovery rather than over-relying on a logic of justification if we're to cope with the constant change and tap into our creative human spirit. The focus on creativity gained through reflective practices connects pragmatism to a tradition of process philosophy, furthered most comprehensively by Alfred North Whitehead in the early 20th century. Whitehead argued that reality is made up of unique and indivisible entities, each of which is constantly in the process of becoming what its potential allows. But the potentialities of each are various, so the process of becoming is unpredictable, complex, and in flux. Hannah Arendt used a different word for a similar idea. She focused on what she described as the miracle of natality, of human beginning, and saw it as a source of constant change and renewal. Beginnings open up the possibility of becoming something new. In her words, the new beginning inherent in birth can make itself felt in the world only because the newcomer possesses the capacity of beginning something anew. that is, of acting. This sense of initiative, an element of action, and therefore of natality, is inherent in all human activities, end quote. This action-focused understanding of human life was fundamental to Arendt's central moral commitment. As she put it, the raison d'être of politics is freedom, and its field of experience is action, end quote. Because each person, each social actor interacts with others, action is also subject to reaction, opening up boundaries and creating almost infinite possibility and inherent uncertainty in human affairs. Social scientists who focus on the study of practices have taken up the pragmatist interest in process and dynamism to emphasize the continuing processes that shape our societies. They are interested in beginnings and in a world of becoming rather than a world of static being. In the world of becoming, people and institutions constantly interact, learn, and recreate their relationships. The construction of practices, of people themselves, and of institutions is never complete. This tradition of thought reveals that humanity is not trapped in social structures. This is not Marxist. We can choose to act and to work towards new beginnings. That said, some structures do have greater power in constraining agency if they are so-called anchoring practices or constitutive rules that can't be shifted without disrupting collectively established realities. Pragmatists acknowledge that there are some principles that, while theoretically revisable, we're loath to revise, as that would rock our world to our foundations. Because seeking knowledge is a practical activity, it inevitably involves change. We seek knowledge actively and we construct it through our efforts. We're constantly making choices about what to consider and how to design research, for example, into social phenomena. That's because understanding societies doesn't result from the observation of external data, but from understanding that which is already understood. The observer is inside the phenomena because she's human, existing within the society under consideration. Now, all of this could lead to stasis, and that is an objection of some people to philosophical pragmatism, if we simply accept what we already know. However, the pragmatist philosophy that I espouse shows how to escape from that stasis. We need to do two things. First, to course correct as we engage in our practices, undertaking a process of continuous self-challenging. This is often called reflexive practice. Second, when we have time to pause in our actions, to reflect upon our practices, we continue to learn, and that is often referred to as reflective practice. Another thread of pragmatist thought that's helpful in understanding the complexity of our world is the emphasis upon the mutuality of knowledge creation. Whereas Weber conflated the creation of meaning within the mind of individuals and meaning that is built up in social interaction, the pragmatists distinguished the two. Moreover, they argued that even knowledge that's created in individual minds is strongly influenced by an implicit background that is socially constructed. Another way of phrasing the point is that knowledge is built up through consensus. Knowledge is not simply discovered as something that exists outside of human interaction. It emerges from that interaction, from human practices that are built up over time as we seek out solutions to problems we face. Otherwise, our knowledge is, as the early pragmatist Charles Peirce put it, merely vagabond thoughts that tramp the public roads without human habitation, end quote. We work to further human understanding through processes of inquiry and contestation, as well as through the exercise of judgment, some in formal settings of adjudication, but often in less structured ways, as we'll see when I discuss modern conceptions of the rule of law tomorrow. Contemporary philosophers describe the mutual construction of knowledge as a form of joint agency, where people build on shared intentions and common understandings. Knowledge is, quite simply, a team sport. In our society, there are many contributors to the construction of knowledge. Philosopher John Searle marvels at the ability of this mutually created knowledge to create what he calls collective intentionality. Concrete things like money come into being simply because we collectively imagine them into existence. Your loonie is meaningless in its physical manifestation. Nothing fundamental differentiates it from any other metal disc. It exists as money because our society recognizes it as meaning something that possesses value. Less concrete objects, like a country's constitution, also come into being through collective intentionality. As we've seen, pragmatists argue more broadly that the very possibility of knowledge is created in forms of shared inquiry, or what we might now call deliberation. A further crucial and controversial pragmatist claim flows from the belief in human activity as the basis of knowledge. Truth is not eternal, but is liable to change over time. Oliver Wendell Holmes used this idea to explain the nature of legal authority, that it's rooted in changing human experience rather than in formal logic or tradition alone. His insight was then adopted and applied to all forms of human endeavor by other pragmatists. A contemporary philosopher makes the point elegantly. To establish a truth pragmatically is to settle a controversial or complex issue for the time being, until something comes along to dislodge the comfort and reassurance that has been achieved, forcing inquiry to begin again. End quote. In other words, pragmatism at least partly undermines the long, powerful correspondence theory of truth, the belief that propositions are true when they match an objective, meaning external to the mind and to social interaction, so-called reality. Dewey expanded on this idea, suggesting that the only meaningful social facts are bound up in human purposes. Social facts inevitably possess both subjective and objective elements. Hannah Arendt argued to similar effect, suggesting that, and I quote, "The more people's standpoints I have present in my mind while I am pondering a given issue, the stronger will be the capacity for representative thinking and the more valid my final conclusions, my opinion," end quote. This idea is central to all claims that diversity produces greater insight and more firmly grounded conclusions. And I'll return to that important argument later. I want to stress now, however, that the idea that truth or laws are liable to change did not mean for the early pragmatists that truth claims are impossible, that everything is relative. Dewey argued that a form of objective truth can be found in the shared practices of societies and in groups of what he called inquirers, because the knowledge created through interactive practices is socially necessary. What's more, inquirers establish rules for what counts as good argument and what can be used as proof, thereby pushing against relativism. For Dewey, then, knowledge was a form of stable understanding. But as I've already suggested, the stability can be disrupted and received truths displaced by further inquiry. As Amartya Sen emphasizes, reason itself is predicated on continuous questioning. That's why there's usually a plurality of sustainable reasons for any course of action. Following in the footsteps of the pragmatist Charles Peirce, Cheryl Misak makes the key point simply, and I quote, "A true belief is one which would stand up to evidence and reasons were we to inquire as far as we could on the matter." End quote. Although we know that our conceptions of truth have evolved in ways that are contingent on historical, social, and material circumstances, we still aim to get things right. In day-to-day practices, we must employ some concept of truth all the time, because otherwise we could not enter into productive assertion and dialogue. We open up dialogue with each other to engage, to offer arguments and evidence so as to improve our thinking and acting, not just to set out eternally parallel positions. That's something that our society today needs to engage with much more fully. In asserting truth for the purposes of aiming at getting things right, we're betting that our beliefs are unlikely to be overturned by further evidence and argument. This truth claim is essential for productive human interaction, is socially necessary, while it remains modest and acknowledges mutability. I want to stress a final point implicit in Rorty's short description of pragmatism with which I began this section. Because there's no human essence or nature that transcends culture, pragmatism acknowledges and respects human and social diversity. Knowledge is created in human interaction and emerges within specific cultural contexts. A powerful example is found today in the much delayed recognition by settler societies of the richness of traditional knowledge in indigenous societies. But interaction also engages culture to culture and society to society. Knowledge can be and is built mutually across borders. Of course, more participants create more complexity. But like Arendt just quoted, Dewey argued that plurality would allow for greater recognition of the most profound issues and the likelihood of achieving more workable approaches to problems. Reality is not straightforward, as President Obama reminds us, quotes, "Glory and tragedy, courage and stupidity, one set of truths didn't negate the other," end quote. I now want to link these pragmatist insights to the expanding study of practices in the social sciences. In so doing, I'll build towards a contemporary understanding of the rule of law that's grounded in shared social practices that are transformed into legal obligations through adherence to particular objectives and procedural commitments. To get there, I must address two deceptively simple questions first. How do we learn to perform the practices that make up our contributions to society? And then, how do those practices turn into law? Some of those practices. What I propose, therefore, is very simple. It's nothing more than to think what we are doing. Hannah Arendt. I suspect that most of us have an intuitive sense that we learn best by doing. Throughout high school and into university, my passion outside my studies was acting. I was lucky to find talented teacher directors and then equally passionate fellow student directors and brilliant professionals who encouraged and stretched me. From the very beginning of my acting experience, I noticed a strange phenomenon. No matter how well you knew your lines, how often you looked over a scene at home, it was not until interacting with fellow actors that a scene would come alive. And it was only after rehearsing many times that you could begin to plumb the depths of meaning in a play, the possibilities for further exploration. Later in university, when I was lucky enough to work with professional directors from New York and the UK, I came to understand that the smallest nuance in inflection, the slightest change in posture or tone could reveal new insights into character and meaning. It was thrilling, and it also created a greater sense of responsibility. What seemed expressively honest? What gestures or vocal intonations might be flashy or superficial? One of the greatest basketball players of all time, Michael Jordan, refined this point. Quotes, "You can practice shooting 8 hours a day, but if your technique is wrong, then all you become is very good at shooting the wrong way. Get the fundamentals down, and the level of everything you do will rise." End quote. It's not just repetition that makes perfect, but refining one's work through discovery and often greater precision that comes with the repetition. But here's the question I want to explore. Does practice make perfect, not just for individuals or teams, but for institutions and societies as well? In the burgeoning literature on practices, various definitions are offered, but I find the work of international relations scholar Emanuel Adler most helpful. He describes practices as socially meaningful, patterned actions that, performed more or less competently, simultaneously embody, act out, and possibly reify background knowledge and discourse in and on the material world. I know there are lots of ideas packed into that single paragraph, so let me explore a few. First, practices are made up of actions in society that include but are not limited to discourse. Dewey conceptualized the public, citizens in democracies, as he characterized it, as a community of action rather than a community of discourse. This is a very important point because discourse philosophy has been very powerful in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Hannah Arendt adopted a similar view, arguing that both speech and action are integral to the classical understanding of the political and the social. She reminds us that, quotes, "The stature of the Homeric Achilles can be only understood if one sees him as the doer of great deeds and the speaker of great words," end quotes. That observation is directly connected to the pragmatist view that our attempts to understand reality are necessarily fluid and changeable. As we've seen, humans act and interact in a world of processes, thereby creating knowledge that is patterned and socially meaningful. The interactions are often verbal because humans work through language. But unlike Habermas, who stressed primarily communicative practice, Adler focuses on deeds in the world even more than on discourse. Even if one accepts that language is the primary vehicle for social interaction, the simple act of giving reasons is not enough to sustain healthy public discourse. Reasons have to be based in some standards of competence and legitimacy. Otherwise, reasons can be mere lies or shared misperceptions. Fake news can be filled with seeming reasons. That's probably why many modern linguistic theorists are doubtful about language's emancipatory potential. Foucault stressed the ways in which language can include and exclude, that it can simply structure and reaffirm existing abusive or at least exclusionary patterns of power and status. Now, the starting points for social interaction in the world are not in a mere void. This is important. That's where the crucial idea of background knowledge, referred to by Adler in the quote I just cited, comes into play, and where conceptual frames around discourse are relevant. Let me focus on these two ideas. In the contemporary literature on practices, background is a term generally associated with the linguistic philosopher John Searle, although it was employed long before by pragmatist thinkers. Searle emphasized that people are inclined to behave in certain patterned ways. That inclination is created by a set of background abilities, dispositions, and capacities that are not part of the person's intention, according to Searle. Rather, the background molds the behavioral intention. It enables linguistic interpretation as well as perceptual interpretation. It shapes narratives and structures consciousness. Others have used the term culture in a broad sense to capture similar insights. Adler disputes Searle in his assertion that background is given and outside the realm of human intention. Consistent with pragmatist philosophy, Adler suggests that background is actually built up itself through human interaction in practices, and that it can be reflexive, self-critical, as the practices are being undertaken, not merely received or given. Anne Swidler, a sociologist, suggests that practices are more persistent and more likely to structure other domains of thought and action when they constitute social relationships than when they're simply habits or assumptions held by individual actors. People in communities of practice share experiences and information, and through that social interaction, they learn, constructing knowledge that shapes insight and behavior for good and ill. Most importantly, people are driven not only by habit and experience, but also by their expectations for the future, on the possibilities of their becoming. That's why even for those people who grow up in strong ethical and particularly religious communities, it is possible to feel deep connection to frames of understanding while also being open to new conceptions and to changing patterns of behavior. This must be true because we've seen dramatic changes in religious practice in countless countries around the world over the course of the last century. A good example is the so-called Quiet Revolution in Quebec from the 1960s to the 2000s, with a move from a deeply embedded rural Roman Catholicism to a strikingly high degree of secularism, but with religious roots. The early pragmatists were interested in the effects of habit. At the same time, they were strongly committed to human agency. Dewey believed that an individual could gain knowledge through what he called the practical arts. This was a form of common sense acquired through changing experience. This connects us right back to Aristotle. While Dewey would not deny that people operate from implicit background and habits, he didn't believe that they were simply inherited and inevitably reenacted. Indeed, Dewey believed that habits are often problems, fixed presuppositions that might be wrong, that could be overcome through knowledge gained in practice. Adler is a principal contemporary exponent of the view that despite the influence of background, humans retain strong agency in their lives and in the ordering of societies. They do this through processes of social learning that take place in the shared working out of practices. Adler argues that human action is inevitably Janus-faced. As he puts it, action is pushed by the past from background knowledge's dispositions, but pulled towards the future with foresight, anticipation, and expectations, end quote. In other words, although humans are of course shaped by where we have come from, we're also motivated by a world that we anticipate in the future. We possess aspirations that help guide our choices in life. I've already introduced the mechanism that allows people, and indeed societies, to change: learning. And I've emphasized that we learn societally in at least two ways. One is reflexive, where we consider what we know in relation to the context in which we find ourselves and we adjust in real time or course correct. And the second means of learning, as I've said, is through reflection, where we engage in what Dewey described as the active, persistent, and careful consideration of any belief or supposed form of knowledge in the light of the grounds that support it, end quote. This reflection takes place after our action and debates and then allows us to reinsert ourselves into social action and discourse with new understandings. Knowledge is created by communities of practice who in turn maintain the knowledge, share it, and further develop it through their collective practices. I'd note that this description of communities of practice is very close to the way legal theorist Lon Fuller described the creation of law, and to whose work I will return tomorrow. Law is formed and maintained through continuing struggles of social practice. Communities of practice interact with other communities, creating what are sometimes called landscapes of practices that are both specific to themselves and interwoven one with another. Adler extends these concepts, arguing that communities of practice create and structure knowledge in particular ways, acting as the vehicles through which both selection and replication of ideas and practices takes place. They are, these communities of practice, collective agents in society, agents not only of ideas, but of material actions in the world. Building on some persistent anchoring practices or constitutive rules, these communities of practice create institutions in society that help to stabilize knowledge and further develop practice and knowledge. Now, I want to stress that anchoring practices don't preclude change and development, because communities of practice continuously interact, as I've already mentioned. In so doing, they learn reflexively and reflectively, measuring their practice against standards of competence generated within the community. What's more, these communities don't remain insular. They interact with other communities of practice, and they're challenged and tested in their understandings of what is competent practice. That's what allows for the pragmatist conception of truth to play out. It's built through complex interactions and is subject to change. Now, in any community of practice, standards or rules evolve, allowing one to assess what is or is not competent practice. This concept reminds us of Michael Jordan's warning that simply repeating things is not enough. We need to refine technique. What's more, competence is not merely the performance of a single action in a correct manner. It's the ability to understand, interpret, and generally act in accordance with the anchoring practices or constitutive rules that shape our engagement within the practice. These rules actually limit what is admissible in arguments, and they shape what is valid supporting evidence. In other words, not every argument is equal to every other, because only some arguments count within the community of practice. I'm going to give a very concrete example of that tomorrow when I talk about torture and the role of the Office for Legal Counsel in the U.S. Department of Justice and elsewhere. Now, this idea that there are limits to what counts in argument is evidently true in law, where, as I will argue tomorrow, arguments are structured by rather particular anchoring practices. I'm going to argue especially the use of precedent and analogy, in addition to the more generic deployment of logic. But it's not enough that communities of practice assess their competency with purely internal measures, for that would mean that utterly brutal or tyrannical practices could be fully justified by their own lights. Through our competent practices, we aim at truth, but we must always enter into dialogue with others, considering and challenging the insights of other communities of practice as they challenge ours. That's why interdisciplinarity, to use a catchword, is so important in effective social studies, I think. Dewey argued that inquiry requires the participation of all voices, with each having the ability to offer and criticize hypotheses. Communities of practice create knowledge through the building up of experience through experiment, but that includes listening to the experience of others. Importantly, competence is not judged only by arguments, but also by actions. Knowing how to act within the practice, sometimes called performative power, is as meaningful as displaying what is often termed discursive competence. Both are required to be convincing to other members of the community of practice and to other communities of practice. Talk alone is not enough. I suppose there's a common sense insight in that, but this is a philosophical justification for that position. These observations lead us directly to the troubling issue of legitimacy. When members of a community of practice fail to act or argue competently, including failing to allow their ideas and actions to be tested in deliberation with others, their contribution to the practice is undermined. And when incompetency becomes generalized within the community, the entire practice may come to be viewed as illegitimate. This result is most likely in transitional times, when disenchantment with practices grows, when practices are seen as failed symbolic performances, as one observer puts it. I think that's exactly the view underlying Trumpian attacks on political and economic elites. The mob that stormed the US Capitol had been convinced that the entire system was corrupt, rigged against them. They perceived the practices of the US economy and of political representatives as failed, both in action and rhetoric. They simply did not believe in their legitimacy anymore. Now, these perceptions may well have been based partly in lies and manipulation, but the effect is nonetheless profound. Competent practice is closely tied to one of Weber's famous forms of authority, the institutional form he called rational legal authority, the form that dominates our disenchanted, as he put it, modern world. It's worth spending a little time on Weber because he's been so influential in discussions of authority, including legal authority, even though I believe he gets some key issues fundamentally wrong. For Weber, the legitimacy of any social order was derived from four bases: tradition, affectual attitudes or emotional bonds, a rational belief in the order's absolute value, and lawful establishment. Rational legal authority depends primarily upon the latter two bases of legitimacy: lawful establishment of an order and a rational belief in the absolute value of the order. These require competent performance of the communities of practice that build, maintain, shape, and reshape the ordering of a given society. For Weber, these competencies included the requirement that official functions be bound by rules and that there are adequate technical norms to effectively regulate the conduct of officials. If incompetence builds, and either or both the lawfulness of the social order or the rational belief in its value is called into question, the power of tradition and of charisma can overwhelm rational legal authority. Interestingly, competent performance at a technical level is likely to be less demanded or expected of orders grounded in charisma and tradition because their sources of legitimacy are different, rooted primarily in history and culture and in emotional commitments. And this helps to explain why, in referenda on constitutional change in divided societies, it's often the argument for change, typically the nationalist or populist argument, that is viewed as more compelling emotionally, with the status quo argument seeming more technocratic and economically focused. This was certainly the case in the two 20th century sovereignty referenda in Quebec, and I think in the more recent Brexit referendum in the UK. It's also why the sheer incompetence of the Trump administration in relation to managing COVID-19, for example, did not matter very much to his tens of millions of followers. Weber believed that in most modern societies, it was rational legal authority that supported the social order. What's more, he thought that it was the belief in legality as represented by formally correct statute law that was the most usual basis of legitimacy. That's why formal legality plays a role in the institutionalization of the modern political system, as Weber put it. I'll expand tomorrow on why I disagree entirely with the idea that the legitimacy of law is founded only in the sociological belief of the populace, and why the conflation of formal legality with legitimacy is dangerous. For the present, I'll only note that Weber himself was troubled by the dominating influence of his version of legal authority within contemporary societies, seeing it as bluntly instrumental and inadequate to the task of promoting autonomy and freedom. Weber also feared that legal rationalism or formalism would not be strong enough as a source of legitimacy to promote social cohesion. Only rational, charismatic leaders could accomplish that crucial function for Weber. These charismatic leaders were not to be demagogues, but people, quotes, who possessed the ethical responsibility to identify the long-term interests of the polity and to motivate diverse societal actors to pursue those interests. I suppose that's close to Platonic. They transformed personal charisma into charisma of the office by institutionalizing the charismatic leadership. I think that Weber dangerously underplays the risk of abuse in charismatic leadership. The focus that I've placed upon pragmatist understandings of action in society and the mutual construction of truth, communities of practice whose background shapes but does not control ideas, discourses, and actions of the community, and my emphasis upon the competent exercise of practice all point to an entirely different form of authority in our social world, one not identified by Weber. Adler calls this epistemic practical authority. This form of authority requires the establishment through legitimated social action of rights and obligations. It also demands performative power, the ability of members of communities of practice to convince others, both inside and ultimately outside their community, of their practical and discursive competence demonstrated through various processes, including interpretation, negotiation, contestation, and actions in the material world. Together, all of this creates, in Adler's words, the legitimate power to rule on the adoption of practices and their meanings. In turn, practices embed and diffuse normative standards within societies. As communities of practice interact, they can also diffuse norms, and I will argue later, including legal norms, across societies. I want to conclude with a final set of issues in relation to philosophical pragmatism and practice theory. The great sociologist Emile Durkheim strongly objected to pragmatist philosophy. He charged that the pragmatists failed to understand the diversity of values. For Durkheim, it was crucial to acknowledge that there are distinct types of value. As he put it, economic, moral, religious, aesthetic, and speculative values are all different. Any attempt to reduce values to one overarching value was doomed to fail, in his view. He thought that pragmatists tried to explain value only in terms of the impact in the world and therefore undermined the important diversity of values. Fundamentally, Durkheim rejects utilitarianism, and I quote, If the value of a thing is determined by the degree of its social or individual utility, the system of human values would be shaken and changed from top to bottom, end quote. In missing out on value diversity, Durkheim thought the pragmatists underplayed moral truths and mythical truths and turned themselves into what he called logical utilitarians. He puts it pithily: the idea that what is true is what is useful is the very principle of pragmatism. He thought that was wrong. I think that Durkheim misreads the pragmatists. Their fundamental point about values was that as received truths, they are changeable. Because knowledge results from doing, rules, values, laws, even truths are more or less useful generalizations, as I've argued, that frame our inquiry until more helpful templates are revealed through our actions and our reflections on those actions. While values or laws are tools of inquiry, the measure of their worth is their ability to point toward further knowledge, not in the advancement of a unique end like material gain, happiness, or even the greatest good for the greatest number. One might say then that the pragmatists are not utilitarians at all, but what I like to call process consequentialists, the key process being the building and rebuilding of knowledge through continuous social learning. In that process, I've argued that critical, reflexive, and reflective learning is central. If inquiry is to a purpose, as Aristotle argued, and is not disconnected from human and social need, as the pragmatists assert, building knowledge requires individuals, communities of practice, and societies to learn from their experience. And this takes us right back to where I started, with the insights of Aristotle. Over time and through experience, each of us must work out what we should do, individually and societally. We do that through both action and discourse in the creation, reformulation, and iteration of practices, as we reflect upon consequences and missed opportunities. Reflexive and reflective learning within communities of practice is prompted by external factors, of course, such as changing material circumstances. Climate change is a great example of changing material circumstances, forcing us to reconsider our practices. But they're also shaped by factors internal to these practices, such as contestation, justification, and mutual performative assessment, competence evaluation. I'm going to argue tomorrow that these processes are essential to the practices of law. This emphasis upon reflexive and reflective learning does not imply that tradition and habit are irrelevant, nor that emotions never influence action. Far from it. But I am arguing that only humans are endowed with the ability to reason and to learn, and that we must factor that into our understanding of social practice. In our day-to-day practices, we consider, we argue, and we articulate diverse reasons. We evaluate, we choose courses of action, and we decide individually and collectively. We are not then, as individuals or societies, destined for anything, nor are we programmed into fixed patterns by our past. Let me repeat the words of Richard Rorty. We can make ourselves into whatever we are clever and courageous enough to imagine ourselves becoming. Tomorrow, I hope to contribute to just such a reimagining of the rule of law. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. And we do once again have plenty of time for some questions, comments, to tease out some of this extremely tightly woven multicolored fabric of thought that has been laid out before us already this evening. If you'd like to raise a hand, I will bring you the microphone so that everybody can be in on the conversation.
Please tell me what didn't make any sense. That would be helpful.
Thanks so much again, Stephen. A wonderful second talk. I wondered if I could pick up on the theme of pragmatism and ask something about pragmatism's commitment to contingency, wondering what the impact of that commitment might be on a theory of global justice, which I take to be your project. Your overarching ambition is to think about global justice. So if we take one of the consequences of pragmatism's commitment to contingency, we start to see that it rejects overly categorical commitments to any particular value in justice, and it seeks to disaggregate and contextualize the impact of any particular idea in the real world. And so if we think about human rights, a pragmatic response to the very substantial literature in human rights now categorically critiquing the value of human rights in the world because it's part of the problem, because it correlates with the rise of global inequality, because it correlates with neoliberalism, might simply be that's too categorical, it's too sweeping. We should disaggregate, break down human rights. Perhaps here it's useful as a tool to promote underlying values in a theory of global justice, whereas there it's counterproductive. And so I'm wondering if this idea about disaggregation and contingency and contextualization is important in the work that you're offering to sort of alleviate the anxieties you've pointed to.
Thanks very much, and it's a really, really important question, and I couldn't get into some of the historical disputes within pragmatism, but actually there are two very distinct strains of pragmatism, and I am following one, and actually I reject the other. The strain of pragmatism that I reject is actually promoted primarily by Richard Rorty in the modern era. He obviously reaches back to forebears, but Rorty was very much of the view that contingency, as you put it, is the key consideration, and that actually Rorty would go much further than I did in challenging any possibility of a truth claim, and therefore would argue that everything has to be deeply contextualized, and that things like human rights, and you'll know that he gave a series of lectures on this, human rights really cannot withstand philosophical analysis for people following in Rorty's tradition. And right now we happen to have a whole forensic industry of people, I think, challenging human rights from a Rorty perspective. What I was trying to argue is a separate strain of pragmatism, which is derived largely from the work of the early pragmatist Charles Peirce, whom I cited. And the key contemporary proponent, I suppose, is Cheryl Misak at the University of Toronto, brilliant scholar. And that strain of pragmatism tries to argue that there is a value in truth claims if they are properly understood. And what I tried to suggest, that the truth claim that is a pragmatist truth claim is one that says we believe from what we know now that this is the very best explanation of a phenomenon. But we acknowledge that there's a possibility that that could be overturned through further inquiry. But for now, we actually don't think that's likely to happen. We think that we've got the best case that we can make as a truth for the time being, and that we then function as a society and as individuals deploying that truth claim rather than focusing on the potential that at some point in the future it may be overturned. It's a subtle argument, but I think it's fundamentally important because it doesn't say that everything is contingent. It says if we're to engage within societies in social discourse, it's necessary that we operate from some basis of competing truth claims acknowledging that they may be overturned by further inquiry. And I think that's how I would approach human rights, that at right now, the best analysis that we can produce tells us that human rights are actually important to individuals and collectivities, and therefore we are going to continue to try to support them, uphold them, and advance them, acknowledging that there might be other frameworks in the future that do an equally fine or better job, but that is for future generations to argue through. But for our generation, we argue from the position of the truth claim that we think is the most convincing state given what we know.
Wonderful, thanks.
Thank you. Max Cameron, just to follow up a little bit on that question, would you argue that human rights are based on generalizable principles, or are they grounded in communities of practice? Because as I'm thinking a little about the kind of distinction that someone like Habermas would make between the exercise of practical reason in ethical discourse, which is about how do I decide what I want to do, what's the right thing to do, versus in moral discourse, what is my duty or obligation based on principles of justice. And his argument against the kind of Republican view that emphasizes the importance of the preexistence of an ethical community for reaching agreement on these matters limits our capacity to build a kind of a cosmopolitan understanding of justice. Where do you come down on that? Because it seems to me that we need some notion of phronesis to navigate in a world in which we might have competing pluralistic understandings of what something like human rights might be.
It's a really tough question and a great question. I think where I stand is probably somewhere where Hannah Arendt stood. I've been reading Hannah Arendt incessantly over the last 2 years, and I have to say I hadn't really explored her work deeply previously, and I've just found it so rich. And one of the arguments that she makes, which I quote very briefly here, is that human rights is actually grounded, as she put it, in the diversity of peoples. Because if you don't accept the diversity of peoples, you can't actually articulate, as she puts it, a theory of human rights that is inclusive. It inevitably then becomes an culturally exclusive value. I think this is one of the great challenges with all of the amazing work that was done, of course, now 40, 50 years ago by Habermas. I mean, so, when you think about Habermas's communicative reason and the importance of democratic deliberation in societies as generating for him the possibility, in a way, of human rights, the challenge that I think he ultimately faced was that he did, I think, believe that there had to be a kind of civilizational discourse, not in the Samuel Huntington sense of clash of civilizations, but in the sense that civilizations produce different discourses, and the only civilization that had really produced the discourse of human rights and democratic deliberation was Western Europe for Habermas. He doesn't say that expressly, but I think one can gain that. And I think that's exactly what Hannah Arendt is trying to push against. Not specifically Habermas, but the view that there's only one civilizational route for key concepts of human dignity, protection of individuals and collectivities. And so I think that if you really genuinely respect diverse peoples and diverse individuals, and she said you had to do it both within national societies and globally, you can, if you do that, I think, develop a discourse and set of actions that can, as practice is iterated, generate effective human rights norms. But I am going to argue tomorrow that that's not just about declaring things. This is hugely important, and this is why the action orientation of pragmatism and of Arendt, who wouldn't have described herself as a pragmatist, but she is, I think, is so important, because one of the frustrations that I've had in the human rights work that I've done over the years is just the articulation of value, moral commitment, absolutely disconnected from practice that either engages or undermines the value, the moral commitment. And I'm going to give some examples of how that happens, I think, tomorrow. So very long answer and only a beginning, even then, to a great question. But I think that I would say that we do have to acknowledge human diversity at an individual level and a societal level if we're going to effectively embed human rights. Before I took my current job, I actually thought I was going to work on a project on the religious bases of human rights in different religions, because I do think, and I'll stop here, that one of the great challenges that we faced in the articulation of human rights in the 20th century and beginning of the 21st is the secularization and the Europeanization of frames of thinking that are actually connected to other frames of thinking. They're not the same, and that's a huge, important point. It's not that all humans and societies are the same. The pragmatist point is fundamentally that they're not, but it's the engagement amongst them that can produce greater knowledge. And I think we've frankly failed in that task in the human rights community in many ways.
Who else would like the talking stick? We have a few more minutes if anyone else would like to get in the conversation.
This kind of relates to what you spoke about yesterday with the age of anxiety, but if we if we can think about climate change as a short-term goal, or I'm sorry, not a short-term goal, but people acting in the short term, and deaths of despair, and corruption issues, or even greed, do you think that those short-term goals are caused by disruptive technologies and artificial intelligence outpacing the human complexity? And if so, then do you think that we'll eventually have robots and AI that are much smarter than humans, and that'll drive more anxiety, and it'll be a downward spiral?
Very complicated question. So let me just start with the AI piece. As I said yesterday, I want to be really clear that I don't want to come across as a Luddite. It's not that I think that technological progress is something we should all fear, inevitably, but I do think your point is exactly the right one. Is there a risk that simply looking at technological solutions and opportunities outpaces our ability to deal with the ethical, legal, moral frameworks that are necessary to give some control, regulation, whatever one wants to call it, over the emerging technologies? And of course, this is not new. We've seen this happen throughout human history. I mean, most recently, I suppose, in new reproductive technologies and biology that sort of leapt ahead of where societal thinking and certainly legal regulation was. I think we're at a point in the development of AI where that is a real risk. And that's why, as I mentioned yesterday, there are now all sorts of institutes being created, sometimes by AI billionaires, to think about the ethics of AI. I mean, we've got one at Cambridge, Oxford's just created one, there's a big one at MIT. This is all going to be hugely important. But I want to link it to the first part of your comment, because there is an impetus based in greed, in short-termism, that could disempower people who want to try to ask hard questions about technological evolution. And I think that that's something we just as a society have to be conscious of and actively resist, because there is so much promise in something like AI. It's the best contemporary example. And there's so much economic opportunity, and it is truly extraordinary. It could have amazingly profound consequences. I mentioned drug discovery, but there are thousands of applications. Because of that, the impetus to short-term thinking and not considering the longer-term consequences of network evolution, of control questions, who has access to data, who doesn't have access, who is an active participant in the world, who's merely a passive source of data. All of these things really matter, and there's going to be a heck of a lot of pressure to jump ahead without thinking about any of those things. So I think we are going to be chasing a wagon to some extent like a dog over the course of the next 20 years. But I really encourage all of us to think hard about the ethical implications of these emerging technologies, because they're fundamentally important, but they bring risks, and we shouldn't just imagine them away.
Stephen, there was I'm sorry that my voice is so strong here.
You're used to lecturing, Tim.
There was a term that kept appearing in your talk today, and to go back to an acting metaphor, it's standing up stage as you're downstage, and that's competence. Mm-hmm. You repeated competence, competency, the adjective.
Yeah.
What part does competence play in the model you're building of a kind of international legal moral praxis?
So I'm going to focus on that specifically tomorrow, Tim, because I think it's fundamentally important. I think if you accept the premise that I've tried to lay out, that in a pragmatist, practice-oriented theoretical construct, there has to be continuing assessment of competence, both within a community of practice, like a legal community of practice, and as between the community of practice that is law, or many communities of practice that are law, and other communities of practice, diplomacy, ethics, etc. I think you have to evaluate competence both within the terms of the community itself, and then also as communities of practice interact with other communities of practice, opening the question about whether there is genuine competence in the practice that's being advocated and enacted within the community of practice. For law, I'm going to argue tomorrow, I won't get ahead of myself, that there are really quite some specific indicators of what competent practice looks like. And two of them that I really emphasize are precedent and sophisticated deployment of precedent, and analogy and the sophisticated deployment of analogy, and that they actually help to construct what is an acceptable argument within law and help you to identify what is not acceptable. So this goes again right back to the point James was asking about. I think there are things that you can do, and there are things that you shouldn't do within a community of practice if you are going to behave competently. And I'm going to give the example that I mentioned of lawyers in the Office for Legal Counsel in the United States that I believe engaged in not only unethical practice, but actually incompetent practice when they gave advice to the U.S. government that certain forms of behavior that amounted to torture were not torture and were legally permissible. Now, that's all, I think, happily been challenged, but I'm going to trace out how that happened and what I think the implications are for how we study law and how we practice law.
I think on that point, which is the preview for tomorrow, we might just bring things to a pause now. Before doing that, though, if you just indulge me for a moment, and if Stephen will indulge me for a moment, another word that came up this evening, not quite as often as competence, though it is, I suppose, a kind of competence, was interdisciplinarity. Mm-hmm. And the reason Stephen needs to indulge me now is that he will recall, as I do actually quite vividly, a time a few years ago during his presidency at UBC when a new strategic plan, academic plan for the university was going through the Senate. And one or two of us, Max Cameron may have been one of the others, fought a desperate and completely unavailing rearguard action to have the I word interdisciplinary slipped in there somewhere. For purely local, rather petty institutional reasons, it couldn't be done at that juncture. It was not the president's fault. And I don't think it was because he had any sense of having to make amends that he referred to interdisciplinarity today, which happens to be one of the code words, key words in the mandate for Green College. It is, however, exciting in any case to be here in the law school, confident that in tomorrow's lecture there will be quite a lot about law and the rule of law, but meanwhile to have had this sensation of a host of disciplines from the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences just across the road being, as it were, sucked into this space. And we'd have to include the economic reason that is now lodged in a form of theological school.
Which itself is such a wonderful metaphor for our world, but then we'll leave it aside.
We've been reminded how important those theological and religious underpinnings of certain kinds of thinking are too. So there could hardly, I think, be a more consummate demonstration of the necessity of the kind of competence we code as interdisciplinary around here than these lectures as we have experienced them so far. But with the promise that indeed things are to be brought home to a certain conception of law tomorrow, though it may not be one that has been rolled out in quite those terms ever before on this site. So if you know any legal scholars who have missed this so far, tomorrow is really the day they should join us. In any case, come back if you can, same time, same place tomorrow for the third in this year's Clyne Lectures. Join me now, please, in thanking our speaker for the second installment. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.